Before we get started, I'm currently on North Stradbroke Island, or Straddy as people affectionately know it. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of North Stradbroke Island, who are the Quandamooka peoples. And I'd like to pay my respects to these First Nations people, to elders past, present and emerging. It's a very special place, and it's always been a place of learning, of teaching and of sharing of knowledge. So it's a privilege to be here on North Stradbroke Island in Southeast Queensland. The Tuesday Telltales is hosted by Southeast Queensland and has been organised this evening by Molina Gillespie, who's the president of Southeast Queensland branch, and Michelle Redlinger, who's a stalwart member of the Southeast Queensland branch. If you want to find out more about Australian Science Communicators, or ASC, you can go to the Southeast Queensland Facebook site, and Molina might put that in the chat, or you can go to the National ASC website and find out more about what it is that we do. But it's my great privilege this evening, along with a glass of mineral water with a dash of gin, to welcome Dr. Tara Roberson to tell us a bit more about her career as a science communicator. Now, Tara, your surname is missing the T. Mm-hmm. Is this deliberate?
Well, I didn't do it, Jenny, but there's some thought on that side of the family that we came across with, I think, convicts. So maybe Roberson.
So how many times do people get that name wrong? Didn't they put the T in there?
Oh, every day, everyone checks. So you go to the doctors and I go, okay, I'm here, I'm Tara Roberson, this is my appointment. They go, are you sure? Is this right? Is your Medicare card right? And I'm like, yeah, it's been a little while now. I've got it.
Okay, well, hopefully no one who's listening now will ever get that wrong. So Tara Roberson, tell us where your interest in science and importantly, science communication, where it started. What did young Tara Roberson think about science and science communication?
So young Tara Roberson wanted to be some combination of Indiana Jones and a vet, which was a very exciting combination. My parents were totally thrilled. And that was kind of the intention up until the end of high school. But in grade 12, I did a communication subject at university and happened to be in a course run by Joan Leach, who was president of ASC a couple of years ago now and is now down at the Australian National University. And it's totally Joan's fault that I kind of fell into communication and I haven't really left it since. So I came back full circle again after doing a Bachelor of Comms, majoring in public relations, but wasn't quite happy just doing strategic and corporate communication. So I did science communication as a master's and fell into the world of quantum physics. And that's where I've been since that time.
Quantum physics and science communication don't seem to me to be matching. So how did quantum physics relate to your science communication career?
So I was doing my Masters of Science Communication, and we had to do kind of a work experience unit where we went into like a research center or somewhere that was doing some form of science and communicate about what was happening there. And there was this research center that was based at the University of Queensland, and they were focused on quantum science. And they had this communication problem in that no one really knew what was going on there, understandably so. So I went in and I fixed up their social media for that unit, and then I stayed. And it's been, I think, 6-7 years now. I didn't mean to stay there, it just happened.
So Justin Trudeau, the President of Canada, is famously known for being able to explain quantum physics very simply. Did you get that knack as well?
It was never easy, honestly. Like the longer you're there, it's almost osmosis. You start to pick up the words and start to understand what they mean. But the default physics in quantum is so odd and counterintuitive. It's always a little bit difficult unless you're there for 10 years, you know, and you do your PhD and your postdoc in quantum. But I think that's what's important then from a science communication perspective is, you know, what do you need to know about quantum if it's going to be always, you know, difficult and counterintuitive? So what's the surface level knowledge that you can get away with?
So can you explain it in a little nutshell like Justin did?
It's the physics of incredibly tiny things. And when we get to this really minute, you know, microscopic atomic scale, physics stops working in the way that it does in everyday life. And we start to have things like entanglement. So two particles talking to one another, even though we don't understand how they're connected, those things start to happen. And some very bright and honestly, occasionally very strange people are able to get their heads around it enough that they can build, you know, technologies out of it. And that's kind of what I look at now.
Well, hopefully everyone is clapping with me because I found that more engaging than Justin's explanation, I have to say. Now, I should say to everyone who's listening, there's a Q&A function on this webinar. So feel free to pop your questions in there. We will have time to take your questions at the end. Very interested to have your questions. And you can also vote on other people's questions. If you think someone asked the question that you would have liked to have asked, then upvote that and we'll make sure that we tackle that question as we go along as well. Now, just rolling back a little bit, Tara, you said that when you were in year 12, you did a university communications subject. Was that because you were super smart or why did you do that?
I was a bit bored. I went to an all-girls Catholic high school and, you know, the social circles are limited, the subjects can be a little limited sometimes, and I was just ready to see what else there was outside in the wider world. My maths teacher hated it though, so I earned an enemy for life there.
But they wanted you to become a mathematician.
They wanted me to spend a lot more time doing Math B, which it was, I just didn't love quadratic equations, couldn't get it.
So you went to university and studied communication and specifically science communication. Was that always your intention to study science communication?
Not really. So partially my partner's fault. I was doing PR and, you know, gonna work for anybody, and she started asking me, well, what will you be doing? What's the purpose of what you're doing? You know, how does it contribute to some sort of, you know, societal good? You know, because we were young and had time to think about questions like that. And, you know, I couldn't answer those questions just sitting in a public relations agency. At the time I was doing an internship at a place that was doing PR for like bikie gangs. And it was a very different world. So I started thinking about risk communication and going into more kind of disaster afflicted areas, but that seemed a bit intense and it was a pretty small niche area to get into. And then I came back to one of my first loves in schooling, which was learning about science and biology and chemistry, not physics, funnily enough. And, you know, I found that was an option and went into it from there. So
you worked for some years as a practitioner. Tell us about that role, and did it help for you to have a communication background as opposed to, say, a science background?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it's been an advantage and sometimes it's meant that I've had to do a little bit more work. So in my practitioner life, I did a lot of work experience. I worked at cafes and theatres and a PR agency and a risk communications agency. And then I went into my first comms role, which was for a sustainable tourism benchmarking and certification organization. So that was really straight marketing and PR. So I learned a lot of the basic skills there that you need if you're going into science communication, in the sense of doing social media and public relations and writing, right? So those have served me really, really well. But sometimes I had to do a little bit of catch up in terms of elements of science that I might be talking about. But I think that's true when you work across different science communication roles anyway. There's always something.
Yeah, so that gave you that background to be able to grasp those things. Now, just going back to quantum physics, one of our participants, Claire Mullen, who mentions about living the dream, Beach and Jen, asks, what's a practical real life example that you could use to explain why quantum physics is useful in the real world?
Yeah. So the best examples come from technology that's being developed in the past, but also in the present. So if you ask a quantum physicist about why you should fund quantum, one of the things that they will tell you is that your smartphone essentially runs on elements of quantum physics in terms of processors and transistors. They might also tell you that medical resonance imaging, magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, has elements of quantum to it. That's from something called the first quantum revolution. Revolution sounds fancy. It was really a certain level of understanding that was achieved in quantum science. We're now in this kind of second phase, and they're creating technologies like quantum sensors. So a quantum sensor can be used to source an aquifer under the ground, and then can also be configured so that you can monitor the levels of that aquifer over time without having to go in and recalibrate that sensor. So it's creating technologies, some of which sound very similar to what we already have, but they have more advanced features or have more fine-tuned abilities.
Okay. Well, going back along your career path, we already have a question in Q&A that's sort of relevant for where we were at. And that is Patrina, hopefully I've pronounced her name correctly, asks, is it realistic to move into science communication as a scientist with no or very little background in communication?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that's the beauty of science communication as a discipline. We have people from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of expertise, and then we collaborate if we have a gap in our knowledge, right? So our president of SEQ ASC, Molina, who's hiding behind the logo there with Michelle, has a background in science and came into science communication and is now doing amazing work at the CSIRO. So it's totally realistic and very achievable.
Excellent. I'd like to move to your next phase, which is when you went bad and you moved from practice into research in science communication.
The dark side, yes.
The dark side. What made you decide to leave the joys of practice? Well, you actually were like me, you kept practicing while you were researching. But what drew you to research?
I love research for the ability to spend a lot of time thinking about issues that might not otherwise be unpacked or, you know, reviewed from, I guess, my perspective, because you're always coming at it from your own particular context in research and in work. I do miss the pace of practice and moving between different projects quite rapidly and getting to try your hand at a lot of different things. Research is slower, which is an advantage and a curse, as I'm finding, especially last year when it was long and quiet during COVID. But I am getting to do really interesting things. And I think as long as I can do that and feel like I'm still contributing back to the discipline, then I'll be happy in research.
Now, going back to your PhD days, I now know that you're in a postdoc. Congratulations.
Thank you.
But in your PhD days, you were particularly interested in hype. Was this a reflection of your days dabbling in PR, which is the really, really dark side?
Says Jenni, coming from journalism, I know. Yeah, I think it was a bit coming from public relations. It was also because at the time that I did my master's in science communication, there was this kind of peak of discussion critiquing the presence of hype in science communication and science very broadly. That discussion never really goes away, but there was this kind of noticeable moment where I thought, oh, this is something that people are really concerned with. And I wanted to know more about that because I thought, coming from public relations, that, you know, hype is not always this terrible thing that we need to stop straight away. I wonder if there's more to that story. So then I spent 4 years thinking about it.
And what did you find out? What was your conclusion?
So my conclusion, and my current supervisor, who comes from physics, says I titled my thesis wrong. So my thesis title is, "Can hype be a force for good?" And he said, anytime there's a question in a title, the answer is no. So I've already had to deal with that. Ultimately, I concluded that hype can be a force for good if we use it in very certain ways. So there are obviously areas like health communication and medical science when we're developing treatments, and hype around those treatments creates this kind of emotional moment for people that are intimately affected by different diseases or conditions, right? And so hype there, it can be really problematic and negative. In the case of something like NASA, which I went around for the first year calling the Kim Kardashian of science communication. That joke doesn't really work as much as it did then, but I loved it. I was really proud of it. You know, something like NASA, they have to use hype because there's not a lot else there when it comes to continually bringing their audiences along this journey of space exploration. Especially when we go into times like last year, where with COVID, where you're thinking maybe this money could be better spent elsewhere. So that really exciting narrative and sensational press coverage plays an important role there for them. And then in a more, I guess, social good, public good kind of sense, what I think hype can do is create conversations about science and technology and how it's being developed. So in quantum, there's this enormous amount of hype around the different technologies that are coming out. There's a truly eye-watering amount of investment in the field across the world. And some people are responding to that hype and that excitement by essentially calling bullshit. And there's a Twitter account, Quantum Bullshit, where they try to dispel some of the sensationalization. So I would argue, and I did in my thesis, that that kind of phenomenon is where hype can be a force for good, because it prompts maybe an eventual change in how we talk about something, or makes us rethink the way we're blindly assuming something will be positive or negative. But yeah, it wasn't straightforward, and I had to think about that a lot when I was pulling my thesis together right at the end there.
I've always thought that science communicators need to be aware of being cheerleaders for science. Mm-hmm. Was that something that you explored, that whole notion of cheerleading for science? And I know that's a particular debate in the science journalism world. And many journalists in developing countries in particular are cheerleaders for science, in some ways because they have to be, to promote the science in the same way that you were talking about.
Yeah, it's this very uncomfortable element of there's a certain level of promotion or excitement that we have to have because of the way our funding works for research and innovation, right? You're not going to go to a politician and say, yeah, none of this works, but I'd still like the money for my fundamental research, thank you. But you don't want to mislead or deceive. And I think that's where hype from any party is a problem, And that's where you really want to make sure that there are different people in the community who can kind of act as, I guess, mediators of that excitement and say, well, hold up there, these other things are happening too, and let's not forget about that. Yeah.
Do you think science communicators have a role to be those mediators in society to say, hey, don't forget this and this?
Yeah, I think that would be a really interesting and exciting path for science communicators to be those, I guess, public experts would be one way of doing that. And possibly science communicators are better placed than, say, disciplinary scientists to actually do that work because they have less of a horse in the race when it comes to, you know, picking a field or picking a subject that they want to succeed.
There's currently an interesting debate in the media about AstraZeneca vaccines and the fact that they have been hyped, but now there's risks. And how do you explain those risks to people without them being vaccine hesitant as a result, or even anti-vaccine? Do you think there's an application in that area to how science communicators look at this whole process?
Yeah, I mean, science communication has played such an important role in this whole time of COVID. And in New Zealand, a science communicator, Susie Wiles, is New Zealander of the Year because of her work in that space. I think science communicators having a better awareness maybe of people and audiences and links into disciplinary science might be best placed to help people draw together those different conversations. It's not going to be easy for anybody, but you know, I think that there's a certain type of expertise that sits in the discipline that could be really well used there.
Okay, don't forget everyone, there is the Q&A function, or you can also put things in chat if you have questions, and we'll take them throughout the whole session. Tara, NASA are leaders in innovative communication technologies. Have you got any thoughts about where science communication's going with some of those new technologies like social media, virtual reality? I mean, I don't think social media is new anymore, but there's certainly some exciting virtual reality type things that are happening out there. And I don't really know the difference between augmented virtual reality and virtual reality, but anyway, that's another thing. But do you think that there is, you know, that science communication can use these tools?
Yeah, I think science communication should use any and all tools that are available to us.
Even TikTok?
Even TikTok. I won't use it, but there are some scientists that are using it in the most amazing ways, you know, singing about astrophysics and all the rest.
You should be using TikTok. It's old people like me that are not using it.
I'm not young enough. I stopped at Instagram stories. I could not get Snapchat, and I think TikTok is just too hard. Terrible. Maybe I'll try picking them up again later, but yeah, for the moment it's just kind of whoosh. But you know, I think that those new technologies like augmented reality can be useful for transforming experiences that can be a little bit dry, like a museum visit, or bringing that content into your home if you're homeschooling or you're stuck in the house because Brisbane's in another lockdown. You know, there are a lot of opportunities there for science communication if they want to use it.
Sorry, that came through on my thing, even though I've got it on silent. Sorry. I wanted to move on to your current role where you're studying responsible research and innovation. So there's a question around that. And you're doing it at an organisation called EQUUS as well as CSIRO.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm sure most people have heard of CSIRO, but what is EQUUS?
So EQUUS is not a horse. It's the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Engineered Quantum Systems. So that's where the acronym comes from. Essentially, what it is a virtual center, a national virtual center for research into quantum physics and quantum technology. And they have nodes in Brisbane, in Sydney, Canberra, and Perth. So it's about 140 researchers at different career stages working together on specific research programs.
Who funds EQUUS and what's the motivation behind it?
So most of the funding comes from the Australian Research Council, which is Australia's primary basic research funder. And the motive behind funding something like a Centre of Excellence is to strategically move research forward in Australia to some sense of national benefit, which is normally knowledge generation and training of early career researchers and students. So quantum in Australia has been funded through Centres of Excellence since the early 2000s. EQUUS is actually in its second round of funding, and each round lasts for 7 years. And that has helped put Australia in a really strong position when it comes to the research behind quantum technologies. And I guess the next question is whether that creates an industry. Yeah.
Now, responsible research and innovation, and I know that this is big in Europe, but it seems to suggest that there is a lot of irresponsible research and innovation. What is it that you're actually studying and how does that relate to science communication?
So what I'm specifically studying is how we can responsibly create quantum technologies. And by saying responsible, I'm not saying that people are necessarily being intentionally irresponsible. But when you're deep into a field of research, and I'm guilty of this myself, it's really easy to forget about other people, how that research might be received, how it might impact different communities and society. So responsible research tries to dig up those conversations and prevent, I guess, things like Clearview AI happening is one, really big example, or Cambridge Analytica. You try to look at the potential problems before they actually happen.
Michelle asked, what about responsible stagnation? I have no idea what she means by that, but I presume it means doing nothing.
Yes. So that's Stevie DeSalle and Fabian Maedvecchi, who
that Fabian.
are very cheeky, very cheeky.
Not responsible at all.
No, hypocrisy all around. But that's the idea of saying, oh, this is a problem, maybe we should stop. Which, as you might imagine, is received with great delight by all scientists. So it's, one of the more hardline arguments that you could make of responsible innovation.
So what are you finding so far, and what implications does that have for research in Australia?
So at the moment, I've been looking at how we talk about quantum technologies, because my foundation work is in science communication. And the problem that I guess I'm seeing is that a lot of these technologies are funded through national programs that are focused on economic gain and defense, so national security. Yeah. And because of those motivations, there's
evil motivations.
Did you say my motivations?
I said evil motivations.
Evil motivations, yes. Well, because of those motivations, there's this really narrow, limited idea of how they might work in any sense of social good. And I've spent the last year talking to people about how we might shift that narrative, which I still don't know how we'll do that, but trying to unpack what the other options are that aren't just, US versus China or US versus Europe in creating these technologies, because it's not a positive way to go about it.
Are you finding that your background in practice of science communication is helping you now in your research?
I think so. For one, I think I remember to talk about my work and share it maybe more often than some of the other researchers that I've met do. And also it makes you so pragmatic. I try not to waste a lot of time. I try to project manage my day and remember what the overall goals are so that I don't get caught in the weeds too often. Still happens, but it helps me kind of pull myself back and work out what I should be doing.
Excellent. Now, speaking about responsible research and innovation and science communication broadly, Pasharina has another question, which is, do you think it's important for science communicators to have a significant social media presence?
Really depends
on
on
in the framework of responsible research and innovation.
Just bring them both together,
yeah.
I guess. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve, right? So whatever type of communication activity you're doing, the first question is, who's my audience? The second question is, why do I want to talk to them? If being on social media is going to benefit your overall project goals and it's going to help you connect with your audience, then it's the right place to be. And if it's not going to do those things, then it might be a waste of time. So that's my perspective on using things like social media.
Okay, I wanted to turn now to one of the other things that was promised in this talk, and that is the queering of science communicator. Now, as someone who is your elder here, Tara, I've never liked that word queer put in this other context, because to me it meant weird and strange when I was growing up. And not only that, but you've made it a verb, or is it an adverb? Anyway,
like a verb.
What is queering science communication, first of all? And then we'll explore what that means.
So queering is a word that has a bit of an academic history and then a more, I guess, literal history. So academically, it refers to taking things away from the assumption that everybody is straight or everybody is cisgendered. You're trying to remove those assumptions and explore the world in its rainbow glory. And then more literally, it refers to people within the LGBTIQA+ acronym. The word is contested. I use it myself because I think it works best
You're way younger than me. That's right. Sorry, Tara.
Like, I use it myself, but not everybody does. So generally, it's a word that we don't use unless it has that very specific meaning attached to it. But the idea of queering science communication, and this is something that I'm working on with Lindy Orthia down in Canberra, is that we start to reflect on that diversity of sex, sexuality, and gender in our discipline. Because up until now, it's not been brought out as much as it could be.
Now, recently there was a special journal edition of the Journal of Science Communication, and you and Lindy were key in that. What were some of the things that were published in that journal?
So there was a beautiful array of pieces that came out in that journal. There was one amazing work on public engagement in the United Kingdom, where a group, it's called Smashfest UK, were taking public engagement to underrepresented audiences and literally going into their towns and their libraries and bringing different types of science communication to them. And they talked about how that has been a kind of neglected area of our discipline, and gave us all kind of homework in terms of how we can improve. And it was really an array of articles focused on different perspectives like that. So looking at the whiteness of science communication was one article, and before that came out, we also had a piece on Indigenous science communication that was also with Lindy and a co-author. So there's a lot of different worlds of science communication that I think we're now starting to explore a little bit more, and that's really exciting.
Everyone, there's only about 8 minutes left, so if you've got some questions, please put them in the Q&A, or if you prefer on chat. There's a question, I think from Michelle, saying, are there concrete examples of queering science communication?
Yeah, so at the moment, Lindy and I are working on bringing these examples together, but you can look at querying science communication in terms of clinical communication, specifically with non-binary and trans communities. You can also look at bringing in LGBTIQA+ perspectives into things like technology development, so that when we create tech, we're not excluding perspectives, and we're not implicitly creating or unintentionally creating damage in the process of creating a nice shiny thing.
Okay. Professor Emily Dawson from the UK talks about how science communication can be quite dangerous when it's not inclusive. Have you seen examples of that in what you've been looking at?
Yeah, so in the 2000s, there was a lot of discussion around gay genes, so gay DNA, and that argument has a lot of history, both with and against different elements of the LGBTIQA+ community, and it needs to be treated with sensitivity, and ideally would involve spokespeople from those communities, because what we saw in the 2000s was that people were dismissive and kind of co-opted that space for their own purposes. And there are different examples of that, but I don't want to run out of time.
No, well, that's fine. So I believe that your next step in this area is writing a book with Lindy on queering science communication. So what are you going to include in your book, and when can we expect to see it published?
Oh, no pressure. So we have a collection of amazing, lots of different authors, because there's no way that people from one perspective in the community would be able to cover off everything. But we're talking about everything from film and TV through to museum content, drag shows. We have content on medical communication. There's a lot there, and I cannot wait to read all of the chapters that the authors are totally writing as we speak, including me. I need to write 2 chapters.
Have you got a publisher already?
We're under review with Bristol Press, and it's looking positive, but I won't jinx it.
Okay, that sounds fantastic. We have 5 minutes left for questions. If anyone has a question, could they please put in the chat or the Q&A. Tara, what's your next biggest challenge in your research side of things, working with EQUUS and CSIRO on responsible research and innovation?
What I'd really like to do is create kind of interactive digital infographics around different types of quantum technologies. So like a sensor that we might use in, I don't know, mining, or a GPS enhanced device that uses atomic clocks, and then have people be able to contribute to those infographics and start to get different non-physicist perspectives on what these technologies might be used for and how they might develop. I have to apply for funding first, but that's the goal, if I can get that in the next couple of years.
So this engagement would happen around the whole infographic. So the scientists would develop the infographic with the science communicator, and then you would engage people in that infographic. And would the infographic change as a result of that engagement?
That's what I'm hoping. So people would be able to contribute content and contribute ideas, and then we could use that to build these different ideas of what the technologies might look like. And we might do that over a successive amount of events so that we can kind of compare them all at the end and see what people are bringing to the table and try for that idea of co-design. We just have to kind of get over the quantum hurdle first. Probably won't even use the quantum word in the description.
And once you have this co-designed infographic, what happens next with it? Is the research changed by this co-design, or are the people who have been involved in the co-design, are they changed? I mean, I'm just wondering what the outcome or the purpose of the co-design is.
So in a perfect world, this will probably be technology that's quite near term. So we're looking at a 5 to 7 year horizon for development. And that information goes back in with the scientists and with the engineers and the design team, and it helps them think through different situations, and it makes it better. And it maybe avoids impacts that no one was able to foresee because they didn't have that perspective. That's, the ideal scenario. If it just changes people's perspectives in terms of the worth of engaging in co-design in the first place, and starts a different conversation in terms of responsible innovation, that's fine too. I have different thresholds of the ambitious aim and then the definitely achievable one.
That sounds really exciting. I mean, it sounds like it's at the cutting edge of where science communication should be going, I think. Speaking of which, are you speaking at the forthcoming Public Communication of Science and Technology Network Conference, which is happening virtually at the end of next month, and sooner at the end of this month with visual presentations?
Yes, I have a roundtable on responsible innovation and responsible novelty. It features 3 amazing people. So Sujatha Rahman, Maya Horst, Alan Owen, and then this other guy, Fabian Medvecki. He's going to tag along and probably put in some opinions as we go.
It sounds like a really good roundtable to visit. For those of you who are not aware of it, the PCST Network Conference kicks off at the end of this month with a series of visual presentations that are online. And then the last week of May, there's a whole 4 days worth of parallel and plenary sessions, including Tara's and including one that I'm also chairing. So, which is on participatory science communication, which is not unrelated to what Tara said. So it's time to wrap it up. I might ask Michelle and Molina to come back on air. There's a link in the chat if people want to copy it about the conference. And you can go to the program side of that link and you'll find out all about the talks. But let me first of all thank Molina and Michelle for organising this session. And most of all, thanks to Dr. Tara Roberson, without the T, for sharing her life as a science communicator to date. I'm sure there's much more to come. Thank you very much, Tara.
Thank you, Jenni.